The morning they told her she would marry Red Bear, she was scraping fat from a deer hide behind her mother's lodge. She did not cry. She did not speak. She pressed the blade harder into the skin until her knuckles went white. Subscribe for more untold Western stories. Comment where you're watching from. The summer of 1867 brought dust and tension to the Lakota camp. Along the Powder River, the woman's name was Ayesha, though few spoke it anymore. She had become simply the daughter, the one promised. Red Bear's woman. Her father had died the winter before during a raid on a settler supply train. Her mother grew thinner each week, coughing blood into rags she burned at night. There were no brothers, no uncles who had survived the wars. The family name carried weight once, but weight without strength becomes only burden. Red Bear was not cruel. That made it harder somehow. He was 30 winters old, a warrior of reputation, a man whose scars told stories the elders respected. He had counted coup 7 times. He owned 12 horses. His lodge stood near the center of camp where the important men gathered. When he walked through the village, children stepped aside not from fear but from reverence. Women smiled at him. Men sought his counsel before hunts. He had asked for Ayesha properly. He brought gifts. He spoke to the elders. He waited the appropriate time. Everything was done according to the old ways, which meant everything was already decided before anyone asked what she wanted. She was 19 summers old. She had been beautiful once, people said, before grief made her face still and careful. Now she was simply young and alone and without prospects. Red Bear's offer was not romance. It was mercy dressed as duty. The wedding would come after the Sundance, after the buffalo hunt, after Red Bear returned from scouting the movements of the Bluecoats, who had built a fort 2 days' ride to the south. Until then, Ayesha lived in a strange suspension. Not quite maiden, not quite wife. She moved through camp like smoke, present but untouchable. Other women stopped including her in their jokes. Young men no longer looked her way. She belonged to Red Bear now in all ways but the ceremony. She spent her days doing the work that had always been hers, scraping hides, gathering roots, hauling water from the river, sewing moccasins her mother could no longer see well enough to finish. The rhythms of survival left little room for feeling, which was a kindness of its own. At night she lay awake in the small lodge she shared with her mother and listened to the wet, rattling sound of dying lungs. She did not let herself imagine what came after the marriage, after her mother's death, after she moved into Red Bear's lodge and became another piece of his well-ordered life. She had spoken to him only twice. Once when he brought the gifts, and she had thanked him with her eyes on the ground. Once at the spring, where she had been washing clothes and he had stopped to water his horses. He told her she would be treated well. He told her his lodge was sturdy and his hunts were successful. He told her she would never go hungry. He did not ask if she wanted these things. The question would have made no sense to him. A woman without family needed protection. A warrior of his standing needed a wife. The arrangement served everyone. Even her silence served, because it could be mistaken for modesty. Red Bear owned 6 horses then. He acquired a 7th in late summer when a young warrior from a band to the north came to trade. The horse was a gift from the young man's father-in-law, who had taken it from a U.S. cavalry patrol the year before. The animal was large for an Indian pony, nearly 15 hands, with a dark gray coat that looked almost blue in certain light. It had been trained as an officer's mount, which meant it knew bugles and formations and the smell of gunpowder. It did not know the open plains or the patient Lakota way of breaking horses through time rather than violence. The animal arrived wild-eyed and difficult. It bit the young warrior twice. It kicked a lodge pole hard enough to crack the wood. Red Bear took it anyway, seeing value where others saw trouble. He was a man who believed in dominance and patience applied in equal measure. He had broken difficult horses before. This one, he said, would become a war horse worthy of its rider once it understood who held the rope. But the horse did not settle. It fought the leather. It reared when approached. It refused feed from any hand. Red Bear tried hunger. He tried long days on a short tether. He tried running it until exhaustion made it compliant. Nothing worked. The animal seemed to hold on to its defiance the way some men hold on to anger, as if letting go meant ceasing to exist. After 2 weeks, Red Bear lost patience in a way that frightened even the men who respected him. He took a quirt to the animal's hindquarters until blood spotted the gray coat. He yanked the rope hard enough that the horse went down on its knees. He shouted at it in a voice the whole camp heard. The horse took the beating without sound, which somehow made the scene worse. When Red Bear finally walked away, his face was dark and closed. He told the other men the horse was broken inside, ruined by the cavalry, not worth the effort. He left it tied near the edge of camp where the spare horses grazed, and he did not speak of it again. Aisha saw the beating from a distance. She was carrying water at the time, and the sound of the quirt made her stop on the path. She watched the way the horse folded under the blows, but did not scream. She watched the way it stood again after Red Bear left, bleeding but upright. Something in the animal's stillness felt familiar. She finished carrying the water. She did not mention what she had seen. 3 days later, the horse was still tied at the edge of camp. No one had tended it. The wounds on its hindquarters had begun to draw flies. It stood with its head low, not eating, not drinking from the small creek that ran nearby. It seemed to be waiting for something, though what that something might be, no one could say. Ayesha walked out to it in the early morning before the camp fully woke. She carried a gourd of water and a bundle of sweetgrass. She did not approach quickly. She did not reach out. She simply sat down near the tether line and waited. The horse watched her with one dark eye, its ears flicking with suspicion. She poured water into a shallow bowl made of bark and set it on the ground between them. Then she sat back and began to hum softly, a song her grandmother had taught her for calming frightened things. She did this each morning for a week. She never touched the horse. She never tried to move closer than the animal allowed. She only sat and hummed and left water, and sometimes a handful of the good grass that grew near the riverbank. The horse began to drink after the 3rd day. After the 5th day, it took a step toward her when she arrived, though it still did not let her near. The wounds on its hindquarters began to close. Ayesha brought a poultice made from yarrow and clay, and one morning she managed to spread it across the worst of the cuts while the horse stood trembling but still. Her hands moved slowly. Her voice stayed low and steady. When she finished, she stepped back and let the animal breathe. It did not bolt. It did not strike. It simply stood there, sides heaving, as if the act of allowing help had cost it something immense. No one questioned why she tended the horse. Women were expected to manage the small labors men did not want. If Red Bear noticed, he gave no sign. He was busy with preparations for a raid on a mining camp to the west. He was gone from camp for days at a time, returning only to gather supplies and relay information to the elders. When he was present, he treated Ayesha with the same distant politeness he had always shown. He did not ask about the horse. She did not offer explanation. But the bond grew anyway, quietly, in the space between duties. Ayesha found reasons to walk past the place where the horse was kept. She began to recognize the way its ears swiveled toward her voice before she came into view. She learned which grasses it preferred, which time of day it seemed most calm. The animal began to greet her with a low nicker that sounded almost like relief. It let her stand close. It lowered its head when she approached, a gesture of trust that felt more significant than any words she had ever been given. She named it Thunder in her mind, though she never spoke the name aloud. Naming a thing gave it weight. Weight meant attachment. Attachment meant pain when the thing was taken away. Still, the name sat in her chest like a stone she carried everywhere. Thunder. For the sound of hooves and the way storms felt just before they broke. Autumn came cold and early that year. The buffalo hunt had been poor. The bluecoats were moving closer, building roads, bringing wagons full of settlers who shot the game and fouled the water. The Lakota camps along the Powder River grew tense and hungry. Raiding parties went out more frequently, returning with less. The elders spoke in low voices about moving farther north, though no one wanted to admit the old places were lost. Red Bear returned from a scouting run with news that a supply wagon would be moving through the valley in 4 days. He organized a group of 12 warriors. They would take the wagon, burn what they could not carry, and leave a message for the soldiers who would come looking. It was the kind of raid that carried risk but also necessity. The camp needed flour, blankets, ammunition. They needed something to make the long winter feel less like slow starvation. The night before the raid, Red Bear came to Ayesha's lodge. He stood outside and called her name once. She stepped out into the cold air. Her mother was asleep, or pretending to be. Red Bear looked at her for a long moment, his face unreadable in the firelight from the nearby lodges. He told her the wedding would happen when he returned. He told her to prepare herself, to speak with the women who would help her. He told her his lodge was ready. Then he reached out and touched her face once, briefly, a gesture that might have been tender if it had not felt so much like claiming. She stood very still until he lowered his hand. He nodded, satisfied by her silence, and walked away. She did not sleep that night. She lay on her robes and stared at the smoke hole above her head and felt the walls of her life closing in like a trap. When dawn came gray and cold, she rose and walked out to the edge of camp where Thunder stood waiting. The horse lifted its head when it saw her. She pressed her forehead against its neck and breathed in the smell of dust and grass and the faint copper scent of old wounds. For the first time in months, she cried. Not loudly, not desperately. Just a quiet leaking of all the things she could not say and would never be allowed to feel. Thunder stood patient and still, bearing the weight of her grief the way it had borne everything else. The raid went wrong. The warriors returned 3 days later at dusk, and there were only 9 of them. Red Bear was in front, his face like granite. Behind him, 2 horses carried bodies wrapped in blankets. One of the dead was a young man named White Hawk who had laughed often and teased the children. The other was Red Bear's cousin, a man whose name Ayesha did not know, but whose wife began wailing before the horses even reached the center of camp. The warriors had found the supply wagon, but they had also found an escort of 12 soldiers with new repeating rifles. The fight had been brief and brutal. They had taken 3 horses and 2 crates of hardtack before retreating into the hills. White Hawk had been shot through the chest. Red Bear's cousin had taken a bullet to the throat. They had died slowly on the ride back, choking and convulsing while their brothers tried to stop the bleeding with hands that shook. The camp descended into mourning. The women cut their hair and gashed their arms. The men sat in the council lodge and spoke in harsh voices about revenge and strategy and the impossible arithmetic of survival. Red Bear did not speak to anyone. He went into his lodge and stayed there for 2 days. When he emerged, his face was thinner and his eyes were distant. He looked at Ayesha once from across the camp, and she saw something in his expression that made her stomach turn. Not grief, not anger. Something colder and more calculating, as if he were measuring what remained and deciding what could be sacrificed. The wedding was postponed. Red Bear told the elders he was not ready. He needed to honor his cousin's death properly. He needed to lead another raid to reclaim what the soldiers had taken. The elders agreed, though Ayesha could see the doubt in their faces. Red Bear was changing. The loss had done something to him, turned him inward in a way that worried even the men who had known him longest. Ayesha returned to her routines, but everything felt brittle now, like ice near the breaking point. Her mother's coughing grew worse. The woman could barely sit up anymore. She spent her days on her robes, staring at nothing, her chest rattling with each breath. Ayesha fed her broth made from bone marrow and herbs, though most of it came back up. She washed her mother's body when the fever made her sweat through the blankets. She sang the old songs her grandmother had taught her, songs about the sky and the earth, and the place where spirits went when the body could no longer hold them. Her mother died on a night when the first snow began to fall. She passed quietly, without struggle, as if she had simply decided she was finished. Ayesha sat with the body until morning, holding her mother's cold hand and watching the way the firelight moved across the lined face. She felt emptied out, hollow, like a gourd with all the seeds scraped clean. When dawn came, she went to tell the women who would prepare the body for the burial scaffold. Red Bear came to her that afternoon. He stood outside the lodge where her mother's body lay wrapped and ready. He told Ayesha she could not stay in the lodge alone now. It was not proper. She would move into his sister's lodge until the wedding. The wedding would happen in 2 weeks, he had decided. The time for waiting was over. She nodded because there was nothing else to do. She gathered her few belongings into a bundle and followed Red Bear's sister across camp to a lodge that smelled like strangers. The sister was not unkind, but she was busy with her own children and her own work. She fed Ayesha and gave her a place to sleep, but she did not ask questions. She did not offer comfort. Ayesha was a temporary burden, a woman in transition, not worth investing in beyond basic hospitality. That night Ayesha lay awake, listening to the sounds of the sister's family breathing around her. She felt more alone than she had ever felt in her life. In the morning, she went to see Thunder. The horse was standing in a different spot now, closer to Red Bear's lodge. Someone had moved its tether. When she approached, the animal lifted its head and nickered softly, and the sound broke something open inside her chest. She wrapped her arms around Thunder's neck and pressed her face into the coarse mane, and let herself feel everything she had been holding back. The horse stood quiet and steady, a living anchor in a world that kept shifting beneath her feet. She began spending every spare moment with Thunder. It was the only place she felt real. She brushed the animal's coat with bundles of dried grass. She checked its hooves for stones. She spoke to it in whispers, telling it things she could not tell anyone else. How she felt trapped, how she felt erased, how she wished she could disappear into the plains and never come back. Thunder listened with its dark eyes half closed, its breathing slow and even. It did not judge her. It did not expect her to be anything other than what she was. Other women began to notice. They whispered when she walked past. They said she spent too much time with the horse. They said it was unnatural for a woman to care so much for an animal. They said Red Bear's horse was being tended better than Red Bear himself. And what did that say about the kind of wife she would be? Ayesha ignored them. She had nothing to prove to women who had never asked what it felt like to be treated like goods. Red Bear noticed too, though he said nothing at first. He watched her from a distance, his face unreadable. She could feel his attention like a weight on her shoulders, but she did not stop going to Thunder. She did not stop finding reasons to be near the animal. It was the only defiance she had left, and it felt important to hold on to it, even if she could not name why. Winter arrived in full, hard and unforgiving. The camp moved to a sheltered valley where the wind was less brutal, and there was still some game to be found. Food grew scarce. The raids had yielded little. The hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not. People began to ration carefully, stretching each meal thinner, saving the best cuts for the elders and children. Hunger made everyone irritable and quick to anger. Small disputes became larger ones. The camp felt like a drawn bowstring, taut and trembling. Red Bear's behavior grew stranger. He stopped attending council meetings. He spent long hours alone in the hills, returning only after dark. When he was in camp, he moved through it like a ghost, silent and detached. The other warriors began to avoid him. Even the elders seemed uncertain how to approach him. Grief had carved him hollow, and whatever remained inside was cold and lightless. He came to Ayesha one evening when the snow was falling heavy and thick. She was in the sister's lodge, sewing a winter moccasin by firelight. He stood in the entrance and told her to come with him. His voice was flat. His eyes did not meet hers. She set down the sewing and followed him out into the cold. They walked to his lodge in silence. Inside, the fire burned low. The space was neat and carefully arranged, everything in its place. He gestured for her to sit. She sat. He stood near the fire, staring into the flames, and for a long time he did not speak. When he finally did, his voice was quiet and measured. He told her the wedding would happen in 3 days. He told her she would be a good wife because she was obedient and did not complain. He told her she would give him sons who would grow into warriors. He told her she would forget the horse. That was the word he used. Forget. As if the bond she had built could be erased with a simple decision. As if what she felt did not matter because it inconvenienced him. She looked at him and saw a man who had never once considered her as anything more than a function. She opened her mouth to speak, but he held up his hand. He told her speaking was not necessary. He told her everything had been decided. He told her to return to his sister's lodge and prepare herself. Then he turned back to the fire, dismissing her the way one might dismiss a child or a dog. She stood and walked out into the snow. Her chest felt tight. Her hands were shaking. She walked directly to Thunder, not caring who saw or what they thought. The horse was standing with its back to the wind, its head low. When Ayesha approached, it turned and pressed its nose against her chest. She held onto its face with both hands and looked into its eyes and saw there what she had not seen in any human face since her mother died. Recognition, understanding, the acknowledgement that she existed as something more than her uses. She made a decision then, standing in the snow with her hands on Thunder's face. It was not a decision born of courage or rebellion. It was simply the only decision left that felt like her own. She would leave. She would take Thunder and disappear into the plains before the wedding could happen. She did not know where she would go. She did not know how she would survive the winter alone. She knew only that staying meant erasing herself piece by piece until nothing remained but the shape of a woman doing the tasks expected of her. She could not live that way. She would not. She spent the next 2 days preparing in secret. She stole food from the sisters' lodge in small amounts, hiding it in a parfleche she kept beneath her sleeping robes. She took a knife, a fire kit, an extra blanket. She memorized the path north toward the range of hills where the pine trees grew thick and the game sometimes sheltered from the worst storms. She would leave just before dawn when the camp was quietest. She would take Thunder and ride hard until they were far enough that pursuit would be difficult. She did not let herself think about what would happen if they caught her. She did not let herself think about the shame it would bring to Red Bear, or the anger of the elders, or the way she would be spoken of as a betrayer of her people. She thought only of the open land and the feeling of movement, and the possibility that somewhere beyond the edge of what she knew, there was a version of her life that belonged to her. On the night before she planned to leave, Red Bear came to the sisters' lodge again. This time he did not ask Ayesha to follow. He stood in the entrance and spoke to his sister instead. He told her Ayesha would move into his lodge tonight. The wedding would happen tomorrow at midday. Everything was ready. The sister looked at Ayesha with something like pity, but she nodded and began gathering Ayesha's belongings into a bundle. Ayesha felt the walls closing in. She felt her stolen food and her hidden knife and her carefully constructed plan crumbling into dust. Red Bear turned to her and told her to come. She stood. She had no choice. The sister handed her the bundle. Red Bear walked out of the lodge, expecting her to follow. She followed. They crossed the camp in silence. The snow had stopped, and the sky was clear and filled with stars. The cold bit at her face. Her breath came out in clouds. She thought about running. She thought about screaming. She thought about dropping the bundle and sprinting toward Thunder and mounting the horse bareback and riding into the dark. But her legs kept moving. Her body kept obeying. She followed Red Bear to his lodge and stepped inside. He closed the entrance flap behind her. The fire was burning bright. The lodge was warm. He gestured to a pile of robes that had been laid out for her. He told her to sleep. Tomorrow she would become his wife. Tonight she would stay here so there could be no question of propriety. He lay down on his own robes on the opposite side of the fire and turned his back to her. She stood there holding her bundle and feeling the full weight of her failure. She had waited too long. She had been too careful. She had let fear make her hesitate, and now the moment was gone. She set down the bundle and lay down on the robes Red Bear had provided. The firelight flickered across the walls of the lodge. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the version of herself who had been brave enough to run. The version who had chosen herself over duty. That woman felt impossibly far away now, like a story someone else had told about someone else's life. She did not sleep. She lay there listening to Red Bear's breathing and the sound of the wind outside and the crackling of the fire. She thought about Thunder standing alone at the edge of camp. She thought about the wedding that would happen in a few hours. She thought about the years that would follow, one after another, each one the same, each one a little more numb than the last. Sometime near dawn, she heard voices outside. They were urgent and frightened. Someone was calling Red Bear's name. Red Bear sat up immediately, fully awake, his warrior instincts sharp even from sleep. He threw aside his robes and went to the entrance. A young man stood there, breathless and wide-eyed. He told Red Bear that soldiers had been spotted in the valley to the east. At least 30 of them, maybe more. They were moving toward the camp. They would arrive by mid-morning. Red Bear's face went hard. He called for the other warriors. The camp erupted into controlled chaos. Women began packing quickly, gathering the essentials. Men checked weapons, gathered horses. The elders stood in the center of camp shouting orders. They would move deeper into the hills, into the places the soldiers could not easily follow. They would split into smaller groups if they had to. They would survive this the way they had survived everything else, through movement and vigilance and the willingness to abandon what could not be carried. Red Bear turned to Ayesha. He told her to pack his things. He told her to be ready to move in 1 hour. Then he left to join the other warriors in organizing the retreat. She stood alone in the lodge, her heart pounding. The wedding was forgotten. The careful control of her life was forgotten. Everything had been thrown into chaos by forces larger than any of them. She did not pack Red Bear's things. She ran. She ran through the camp toward the place where Thunder was kept. Women were running everywhere. Children were crying. Men were shouting. No one noticed her. No one tried to stop her. She reached Thunder and untied the rope with shaking hands. The horse was agitated, sensing the panic in the air. She grabbed a handful of mane and swung herself onto its back. She had no saddle, no bridle, only the rope halter and her own desperation. She turned Thunder toward the north and kicked its sides. The horse needed no further urging. It leapt forward, hooves pounding against the frozen ground. They moved through the camp in a blur of motion, past lodges being torn down, past women clutching babies, past warriors mounting their own horses. Ayesha did not look back. She leaned low over Thunder's neck and let the animal run. They broke free of the camp and into the open land beyond. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the snow pink and gold. Behind them, she could hear shouting, but she did not slow. Thunder ran with a power she had never felt before, as if the animal had been waiting its entire life for this moment. They moved across the valley floor and up into the foothills, climbing toward the pine forests that rose dark and dense against the pale sky. They rode for hours. Thunder's breath came in great clouding bursts, but the horse did not falter. Ayesha's legs ached from gripping its sides. Her hands were numb from cold. Her face was raw from the wind. She did not care. She felt more alive than she had felt in months. She felt like herself again, or perhaps like a version of herself she had never been allowed to become. When they finally stopped, it was in a narrow canyon where a creek ran unfrozen beneath a shelf of ice. Thunder's sides were heaving. Foam flecked its neck and chest. Ayesha slid from its back and nearly collapsed when her feet hit the ground. Her legs would not hold her. She sat down hard in the snow and let herself breathe. Thunder stood over her, blowing hard, its dark eyes watching the way they had come. The horse was listening for pursuit. Ayesha listened too, but she heard only the wind and the rush of water and the occasional crack of ice settling. They were alone. They had escaped. She let herself cry then, but this time the tears were different. They were not grief or fear, they were release. She cried for the girl she had been, who had done everything right and lost everything anyway. She cried for her mother and her father, and the version of her life that had been decided before she was old enough to understand what decision meant. She cried until she had nothing left, and then she stood up on shaking legs and went to Thunder. The horse lowered its head and she pressed her forehead against its nose. She told it thank you. She told it she was sorry for whatever came next. She told it she had made them both fugitives, and she did not know how to unmake that choice. Thunder blew warm air against her face and neck, a gesture she had come to recognize as affection. The animal did not care about shame or duty or the consequences of defiance. It cared only that they were together and that they had run. They rested for an hour. Aisha let Thunder drink from the creek while she ate a small piece of the food she had hidden in her dress. It was not much. Enough for 2 days, maybe 3 if she was careful. After that, she would have to hunt or forage or find a way to survive that she had not yet imagined. She did not let herself think that far ahead. Thinking too far made the impossibility of her situation crush down on her like a weight she could not bear. They moved again as the sun reached its peak. Aisha kept them to the high ground, following game trails that led deeper into the hills. She had no plan beyond distance. She needed to put as much land between herself and the camp as possible before anyone had time to organize a search. She did not know if they would search. Red Bear had more immediate concerns with the soldiers, but eventually he would remember her. Eventually he would realize what she had taken. The horse was valuable. She was promised property. Men like Red Bear did not tolerate theft or disobedience. That night she found a small cave tucked into the side of a ridge. It was barely large enough for her and Thunder both, but it blocked the wind and hid them from view. She built a tiny fire using branches she gathered from the scrub pine nearby. She fed Thunder the last of the grass she had taken from camp. The animal was tired but calm, as if it understood they were safe for the moment. Aisha sat with her back against the horse's side, drawing warmth from its body, and stared at the small fire until her eyes grew heavy. She did not mean to sleep, but exhaustion took her under. When she woke it was still dark, and Thunder was standing rigid, ears forward, nostrils flaring. Aisha sat up, her heart hammering. She heard it then. Voices, distant but growing closer. Men calling to each other in Lakota, searchers. She moved quickly, smothering the fire with handfuls of dirt. She led Thunder out of the cave and up the ridge, moving as quietly as she could over the frozen ground. The voices grew louder. She could see torches flickering below, moving along the trail she had followed earlier. There were 3 of them, maybe 4. They were tracking her. She did not have time to think. She mounted Thunder and urged the horse up the steep slope of the ridge. The animal struggled, hooves slipping on ice and loose stone. Aisha leaned forward, whispering encouragement, begging the horse not to fall. Behind her, the voices changed pitch. Someone had seen them. Someone was shouting. Thunder lunged upward, and they crested the ridge, just as the first arrow hissed past Aisha's head. She kicked Thunder hard, and the horse surged forward, plunging down the opposite slope at a reckless speed. Branches whipped at her face. The ground fell away in places, forcing Thunder to leap over gaps she could not see. They crashed through brush and over rocks, moving on instinct and terror. Behind them, the voices faded. The pursuit could not follow at this speed in the dark. They ran until Thunder could run no more. The horse slowed to a stumbling walk, sides heaving, head hanging low. Aisha slid from its back and held its face in her hands, checking for injuries. There were cuts on its legs and chest from the brush, but nothing deep. She led the animal to a stand of pine trees where the snow was not as deep, and they could rest hidden from view. She did not build a fire. She sat with her back against a tree trunk, Thunder standing beside her, and waited for dawn. She was shaking, though whether from cold or fear or the aftermath of adrenaline she could not tell. She had been found. They were hunting her. Red Bear would not stop until she was brought back, or until he decided she was not worth the effort. She did not know which outcome was more likely. When dawn came gray and cold, she stood and looked around. They were deep in the hills now, in country she did not recognize. The pine forest stretched in every direction, dense and trackless. She had no food left. She had no plan. She had only thunder and the knife in her belt and the stubborn refusal to go back. She chose a direction that felt like north and began walking, leading Thunder by the rope. The horse followed without resistance, trusting her even though she had no idea where they were going. They moved through the forest slowly, stopping often to let Thunder rest. Ayesha searched for anything edible. She found a few frozen berries clinging to bare branches. She dug beneath the snow and found the dried remnants of wild onions. It was not enough. Her stomach cramped with hunger. Thunder was faring no better, pulling at bark from the pine trees in desperation. On the third day they found a frozen stream and followed it downhill into a wider valley. The trees thinned. The land opened up into a meadow covered in snow. Ayesha was weak now, lightheaded, her thoughts slow and disconnected. Thunder's ribs were beginning to show through its coat. They needed food. They needed shelter. They needed help or they would both die out here alone. She saw the smoke first. A thin line rising from a cluster of trees on the far side of the meadow. Her first instinct was to run, but she had no strength left for running. She stood at the edge of the meadow and stared at the smoke and tried to decide if hope or fear should win. She led Thunder toward it. As they got closer, she saw it was not a Lakota camp. The structure was wrong. The smoke smelled of pine and burning fat, not the buffalo chips her people used. A cabin emerged from the trees, small and rough-built, with a lean-to attached to one side. A white man's shelter. Ayesha stopped. Every instinct told her to turn back. White men meant danger. They meant violence and theft and a long history of broken promises her people had learned not to trust. But she was starving. Thunder was starving. They would not survive another day without food. She approached slowly, leading Thunder. She stopped 50 feet from the cabin and called out in English, one of the few phrases she knew. "Hello." She waited. No response. She called again. "Hello, please." The door of the cabin opened. A man stepped out. He was old, maybe 60 winters, with a gray beard and deep lines around his eyes. He wore buckskin and a fur hat. He held a rifle, but he did not point it at her. He stood on the step of his cabin and looked at her for a long time. Then he lowered the rifle and said something in English she did not understand. She shook her head. He tried again in halting, broken Lakota. "Who are you? Where are your people?" She did not know how to answer. She gestured to herself and then to Thunder. She touched her stomach and made the sign for hunger. The old man watched her carefully. Then he nodded and gestured for her to come closer. She did not trust him, but she had no choice. She led Thunder to the cabin. The old man disappeared inside and returned with a bucket of oats and a strip of dried meat. He set the oats on the ground for Thunder and handed the meat to Ayesha. She took it and ate without hesitation, tearing at it with her teeth, too hungry to be cautious. The old man watched her eat. When she finished, he asked her questions she only half understood. "Are you alone? Are you running?" She nodded when she caught words she recognized. The man looked at Thunder, then back at her. He seemed to be thinking. Finally he gestured to the lean-to. She could stay there, he seemed to say, for a while. Until she decided what came next. She did not understand why he was helping her. She did not understand what he wanted in return. But she was too tired to question it. She led Thunder to the lean-to and saw that it was filled with hay and sheltered from the wind. The horse began eating immediately. Ayesha sat down in the hay beside Thunder and closed her eyes. She woke to the sound of footsteps. The old man was standing in the entrance of the lean-to holding a bowl of something hot. Stew, she realized. He set it down near her and backed away, giving her space. She ate slowly this time, letting the warmth fill her. The man said something in English and then in Lakota. "My name is John." She nodded but did not give her own name. John did not ask again. He left her alone for the rest of the day. She stayed in the lean-to with Thunder, eating the food John brought, sleeping when exhaustion took her. Thunder recovered more quickly than she did. The horse's strength returned with the oats and hay. By the second day, Thunder was moving around the lean-to, restless and alert. Aisha spent that time trying to understand where she was and what happened next. John seemed content to let her stay without explanation. He came twice a day with food and water. He did not try to touch her. He did not ask for anything. He simply provided what was needed and then returned to his cabin. On the third day, she ventured out of the lean-to and found John chopping wood behind the cabin. He stopped when he saw her and wiped sweat from his forehead. He said something she did not understand, then tried again in Lakota. "You are feeling better." She nodded. She asked him in halting words why he was helping her. John looked at her for a long time. Then he said, in slow, careful Lakota, that he had a daughter once. She had black hair like Ayesha. She had run away from something bad. She had died alone in the cold because no one helped her. He did not say more. He did not need to. Ayesha felt something shift in her chest. She asked him what he wanted from her. John shook his head. "Nothing," he said. "When you are ready, you go. Until then, you stay." She stayed for 2 weeks. She helped John with small tasks, hauling water, tending the fire, scraping hides he had collected from his trap lines. She spoke little, and he spoke little, and the silence between them felt comfortable rather than strained. Thunder grazed in the meadow during the day and slept in the lean-to at night. The horse was healthy again, strong, ready to move if needed. But Ayesha was not ready. She did not know where to go or what she was moving toward. She only knew she could not go back. The thought of Red Bear and the camp and the life that had been waiting for her felt like death. She would rather freeze out here than return to that. John seemed to understand. One evening he sat with her by the fire outside the cabin and told her, in his broken Lakota, about the country to the north. There were other bands up there, he said, Shoshone, some Crow, some mixed groups of people who had left their tribes for one reason or another. They lived in the high country where the soldiers rarely went. They survived on what they could hunt and trade. It was hard living, he said, but it was free. Ayesha listened and felt something like hope stir in her chest. She asked him if he thought they would take her. John shrugged. Maybe, he said, if you are useful. If you do not bring trouble. She thought about that. She was useful. She could work. She could survive. Thunder was strong and trained, valuable to any group that needed horses. Maybe there was a place for them somewhere beyond the edge of the world, she knew. She decided to leave the next morning. John packed food for her, enough for a week if she was careful. He drew her a rough map in the dirt, showing her which valleys to follow and which peaks to aim for. He told her to avoid the river routes where the soldiers patrolled. He told her to move at night when she could. He told her to trust the horse. When dawn came, she led Thunder out of the lean-to and prepared to go. John stood on the step of his cabin watching her. She walked over to him and said thank you in English, one of the few phrases she was certain of. John nodded. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle. A pistol, old but functional, and a pouch of ammunition. He pressed it into her hands. He said, in Lakota, "You will need this." She started to refuse, but he shook his head. "Take it," he said. "My daughter did not have a way to protect herself. You do now." Ayesha took the gun. She tucked it into her belt and felt the weight of it against her hip. She met John's eyes and nodded once, a gesture of respect and gratitude that needed no words. Then she mounted Thunder and rode north into the hills without looking back. She traveled for days, following the map John had drawn in her memory. The land was harsh and empty, but she moved through it with a growing confidence. Thunder was steady and sure-footed, carrying her over terrain that would have been impossible on foot. They avoided trails and settlements. They moved like ghosts through a world that did not know they existed. On the 8th day, she saw smoke rising from a valley ahead. Not the smoke of a cabin, the smoke of a camp. She approached carefully, staying hidden in the tree line. Below her, she saw lodges scattered in a loose circle. But these were not Lakota lodges. The designs were different. The people moving through the camp wore a mix of traditional and white man's clothing. She saw Shoshone patterns. She saw crow braids. She saw faces that carried the marks of different tribes and different stories. She waited until dusk, then led Thunder down into the valley. A group of men saw her approach and came to meet her, their hands on their weapons, but not yet drawn. She stopped and raised her hand in the universal gesture of peace. One of the men stepped forward. He was older, with gray in his hair and scars on his face that spoke of a long and difficult life. He asked her in Shoshone who she was. She answered in Lakota, knowing he would not understand all of it, but hoping the tone would convey what words could not. She told him she was alone. She told him she needed a place to stay. She told him she could work. The man studied her, then looked at Thunder. He said something to the other men in a language she did not know. They argued briefly. Finally, the older man turned back to her and spoke in slow, simple Lakota. "You can stay," he said, "but if you bring soldiers, we will kill you. If you steal, we will kill you. If you make trouble, you leave." She nodded. She understood. This was not hospitality. This was survival. They were all running from something. They all had reasons to be here instead of with their own people. As long as she did not threaten that fragile safety, she would be allowed to remain. They gave her a space at the edge of the camp where she could set up a small shelter. They gave her hides and a frame. She built it herself while Thunder grazed nearby. The people watched her but did not help. She did not expect them to. She had to prove she could carry her own weight before they would accept her as part of the group. She spent the first weeks doing whatever work was needed. She hauled water. She scraped hides. She helped the women prepare food and tan leather. She said little and kept her head down. Slowly, the people began to relax around her. They began to include her in the daily rhythms of the camp. She learned their names. She learned their stories, or the pieces of their stories they were willing to share. There was a Crow woman who had left her husband after he beat her so badly she lost the use of one arm. There was a Shoshone man who had killed another man over a stolen horse and could not return to his band without facing execution. There was a white trapper who had taken a Ute wife and been cast out by both his people and hers. They were all fugitives in one way or another. They were all rebuilding lives from pieces of lives that had shattered. Ayesha fit among them in a way she had never fit in her own camp. Here, no one cared about her lineage or her duties or what she was supposed to become. They cared only that she worked and did not cause problems. It was a freedom she had not known existed. She could wake each day and decide for herself what that day would hold. She could speak or stay silent. She could rest or work. She could be herself without apology or explanation. Thunder became part of the camp's small herd of horses. The animal thrived, growing sleek and strong on the good grass of the valley. Ayesha visited Thunder every day, and the horse always greeted her with that low nicker that had become as familiar as her own heartbeat. Other people began to notice the bond. They commented on how well-trained the horse was, how responsive to her commands. They asked where she had gotten such an animal. She told them it had been given to her. It was not quite a lie. Thunder had been given to her by circumstance and by the choice to run. The horse was hers now in a way that had nothing to do with ownership and everything to do with mutual survival. Winter deepened. The camp hunkered down against the cold. Food grew scarce, but the hunters managed to bring in enough deer and elk to keep everyone fed. Ayesha learned to shoot the pistol John had given her. She practiced in secret, away from the camp, until she could hit a tree trunk from 20 paces. She did not know if she would ever need to use it, but having the skill made her feel less helpless. One night, as she sat by the fire outside her shelter, The older man who had first spoken to her came and sat down beside her. His name was Grey Hawk, though he no longer claimed the tribe that name had come from. He asked her why she had left her people. She considered lying, but there seemed no point. She told him about Red Bear, about the arranged marriage, about the way her life had been decided without her consent, about Thunder and the bond that had made her realize she could not live as someone else's property. Grey Hawk listened without interrupting. When she finished, he nodded slowly. He told her he understood. He told her he had a sister once who had been promised to a man she did not want. She had hanged herself from a tree rather than go through with the marriage. The family had called it shame. Grey Hawk called it the only choice she had left. He told Ayesha she had done a braver thing. She had chosen to live, even if that life was uncertain and hard. He told her that kind of bravery was rare, and the camp was better for having her in it. She did not know what to say to that. She had never thought of what she did as brave. It had felt like desperation, like the thrashing of a trapped animal. But maybe that was what bravery was sometimes. The refusal to stop thrashing. The seasons turned. Spring came slow and cold, but it came. The snow melted. The grass returned. The hunters ranged farther and came back with better kills. The camp felt less fragile, less like it might collapse at any moment. Ayesha had been there 6 months. She had a place. She had a role. She had people who nodded to her in passing and included her in the work without question. She had made something like a life. But the past was not finished with her. It never is. They came on a morning in early summer when the valley was green and the sky was bright. 3 riders appeared on the ridge above the camp. Ayesha saw them from a distance and felt her stomach drop. She knew the shape of them. She knew the way they sat their horses. Lakota. The camp went on alert immediately. Weapons were readied. Children were moved into the center. Grey Hawk and the other men formed a line between the camp and the riders. Ayesha stood frozen, her hand on the pistol at her belt. The riders came down slowly, hands raised in peace. As they got closer, Ayesha recognized the one in front. Not Red Bear, his cousin. A man named Tall Horse who had survived the raid that killed Red Bear's other cousin. He was flanked by 2 younger warriors she did not know. Tall Horse stopped 20 feet from the camp. He called out that he came in peace. He said he was looking for someone. He said her name, Ayesha. Grey Hawk turned and looked at her. She met his eyes and saw the question there. "This is your choice," his expression said. "We will stand with you, or we will send you away. But you have to decide." She stepped forward. She walked through the line of men and stood facing Tall Horse. She asked him what he wanted. Her voice was steady, even though her hands were shaking. Tall Horse looked at her for a long moment. Then he said that Red Bear was dead. He had been killed 3 months ago in a skirmish with soldiers. His death had been quick, an arrow to the chest. The camp had mourned him. They had honored him. But with his death, the promise he had made was ended. There was no marriage to return to, no obligation to fulfill. Ayesha felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Dead. Red Bear was dead. The man who had controlled her future was gone, and with him the life she had run from. Tall Horse continued. He said the elders had sent him to find her. Not to bring her back, but to tell her she was released. She owed nothing to the tribe. She could return if she wished, or she could stay wherever she had gone. The choice was hers. He paused, then added something else. He said Red Bear had asked for the horse before he died. He wanted it brought back. It was valuable, and the camp needed valuable things. But when Tall Horse and his men went to retrieve it, they found it was gone. They asked around and learned that Ayesha had taken it when she fled. Tall Horse said he understood why. The horse was hers now, in all the ways that mattered. He would not ask for its return. He reached into his bag and pulled out a small bundle. He rode forward slowly and handed it down to her. She took it and opened it. Inside were her mother's sewing tools and a bundle of her grandmother's beadwork, things she had left behind when she ran. things that were hers by right of blood and memory. Tall Horse said the captain did not hold her running against her. Many people understood. Some even admired it. He told her she was welcome to return, but only if she wanted to. If she chose to stay where she was, the tribe would consider her debt paid and her path her own. Then he turned his horse and rode away, the two young warriors following. Ayesha stood holding the bundle and watching them disappear over the ridge. She felt hollowed out, emptied of everything she had been carrying for the past year. Red Bear was dead. The threat was gone. She was free. Gray Hawk came and stood beside her. He asked if she wanted to go back. She looked at him, then at the camp behind him. She looked at Thunder grazing peacefully in the meadow. She thought about the woman she had been a year ago, silent and obedient and half dead inside. She thought about the woman she was now, scarred and hard and alive. She told Gray Hawk she was staying. He nodded as if he had expected that answer. He put a hand on her shoulder briefly, a gesture of approval, then walked back toward the fire where the morning meal was being prepared. The rest of the camp returned to their work. The moment passed, absorbed into the ordinary rhythms of survival. Ayesha went to Thunder. She pressed her face against the horse's neck and breathed in the familiar smell of dust and grass. Thunder turned its head and nuzzled her shoulder, patient and steady as always. They had run together. They had survived together. They had built something between them that had nothing to do with duty or obligation and everything to do with choice. She had been promised to a warrior. She had been told what her life would be. She had accepted it because she thought she had no other option, but Thunder had shown her a different way. Not through words or plans or grand gestures, simply through existing as something that needed her and that she needed in return. Through being the one thing in her life that was hers and hers alone. She had fallen in love with the horse the way people fall into belief. Slowly, then all at once, until the world reorganized itself around that central truth. And that love had saved her. It had given her the courage to run and the strength to keep running when everything in her screamed to give up. It had carried her across the frozen land and into a new life she was still learning how to live. She stayed with the camp for 3 more years. She became one of the respected members, someone the others came to for advice on horses and healing. Thunder sired several foals, all of them strong and sure-footed like their father. Ayesha trained each one with the same patience Thunder had taught her, building trust instead of breaking spirits. She never married. She never returned to the Lakota. She lived her life on her own terms, in a place where no one asked her to be anything other than what she was. When she was old and her hands were too stiff to work leather anymore, she still walked out to the meadow every morning to stand with Thunder. The horse was old too by then, gray around the muzzle, slower in its movements, but it always lifted its head when it saw her coming. It always nickered that same low greeting. She died in her sleep one winter night when she was 43 years old. Gray Hawk found her in the morning, lying on her robes with her face peaceful and her hands folded on her chest. They buried her on the hillside overlooking the valley, in the place where the wind moved through the grass like water. Thunder stood by the grave for 3 days, refusing to move or eat. On the 4th day, the horse walked out into the meadow and lay down in the grass. It closed its eyes and did not open them again. They buried Thunder beside Ayesha, because everyone in the camp understood that some bonds do not end with death. The Shoshone woman who could no longer use her left arm made a marker for the grave. She carved it from a piece of pine and burned Ayesha's name into the wood. Below the name, she carved the image of a horse running. Not because Ayesha had asked for it, but because everyone who knew her story understood that she and Thunder were the same thing in the end. 2 creatures who had found freedom in each other and had refused to let anyone take that freedom away. Years later, when people asked about the grave on the hillside, the old ones who remembered would tell the story. They would speak of the woman who was promised to a warrior but chose a horse instead. They would speak of courage that looked like madness until you understood it. They would speak of love that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with recognizing yourself in another living thing. The story became a kind of teaching, passed down when young people asked about duty and choice and the difference between the two. The elders would tell them about Ayasha and thunder, and they would let the young people draw their own conclusions about what kind of life was worth living and what kind of freedom was worth dying for. The grave remained on that hillside for generations, tended by people who never knew Ayesha but who understood what she represented. The marker eventually rotted and fell away, replaced by nothing but the grass and the wind and the memory of a woman and a horse who had saved each other in the only way that mattered. They had given each other permission to run. And in running, they had found something that looked like home.
Thanks for watching this story till the end. Comment below and tell me where you're watching from. And before you go, check out these other amazing Western stories waiting for you next. Subscribe, like, and I'll see you on the next ride.